I'm Frank. Today, we're admiring the first half of Chapter 36, The Cold War Begins, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook.
Today, we have a special guest with us. Madam, would you please introduce yourself?
I'm Phyllis Schlafly.
Well, Phyllis, will you start us off?
Yeah, so one of the most positive effects of World War II is that it finally took America out of the Depression. At the same time, however, the gross national product immediately began to decrease after the war, and prices surged upward by around 33% from 1946 to 1947. In 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act that placed many limits on unions, including prohibiting the closed shop, making unions liable for damages they caused, and requiring union leaders to vow non-communism. Furthermore, Operation Dixie was launched in the South with the goal of grouping Southern steel and textile workers into unions. Unfortunately, Operation Dixie failed due to fears of racial mixing and the prevalence of part-time workers. Next, the Democrats backed and passed the Employment Act of 1946, which required the government to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. And the last piece of legislation in the immediate post-war period was the GI Bill, which allowed the government to pay the required tuition and to send former soldiers to school. The GI Bill was a success in that it stimulated the economic expansion in the late 1940s. So Frank, can you tell me a little bit more about the economy?
Absolutely. Between 1950 and 1970, America began a period of uninterrupted economic growth. In fact, by 1973, Americans controlled 40% of the world's wealth. This economic expansion led to reforms in civil rights and Medicare, as America had more money to finance welfare programs. More importantly, the middle class grew rapidly. In fact, it doubled during this time period. Additionally, the growth of urban white-collar jobs and shops led to increased employment opportunities for women, which helped the growth of the middle class even more. But Abe, can you extrapolate for us on the sources of this economic boom?
Of course. The American economy boomed after World War II for a few reasons. 1. The permanent war economy led to massive defense spending, which fueled the high technology industries and led to increased scientific research and development, R&D. 2. Low energy prices, leading to a highway construction and air conditioning boom. 3. Increased worker productivity due to the new technology and increased education. 4. The shift of the workforce out of agriculture, since less farmers were needed to produce the nation's food supply. All right, Phyllis, could you tell me about the other effects of World War II?
Well, Abe, the baby boom led to a massive influx of new families to the West in the 15 states that made up the Sun Belt. This led to a massive increase in economic activity along this new frontier, but it corresponded with the decline of industrial centers such as Detroit and the Ohio Valley. These areas became known as the Rust Belt.
Ooh.
The second major impact was the massive rise in congressional representation for these states, as can be seen in the fact that California now has more representatives and electoral college votes than any other state. So Frank, where did the white people migrate to during this time?
Well, Phyllis, as the century pressed on, whites began to leave cities and journey to the suburbs, a journey made all the easier by heavy government investment into the federal highway system. Construction of houses and apartments boomed as well, and the Leviton style of construction made housing cheap and affordable. This became more and more popular. Unfortunately, the move of blacks into the inner city and whites into the suburbs harmed American society overall. Government loans programs sometimes refused to give mortgages to African Americans, which led to them being packed together in low-cost housing. This led to a more homogeneous sectors of an area and a less diverse country overall. But Abe, can you extrapolate on the baby boom that Phyllis talked about earlier?
Yes, the baby boom occurred after World War II when more than 50 million babies were born by the end of the 1950s. However, by 1973, birth rates dropped so low that the existing population level would not have been maintained without immigration. As the baby boom generation matured, they strained the baby product industry in the 1940s, the clothing and rock music industry in the 1960s, and the job market in the 70s and the 80s. All right, Schlafly, who became president after the acclaimed FDR?
Well, Truman became president after FDR died, and he was known as the average man's average man. He didn't even have a college education. Truman was cocky and confident, but was a very authentic man. One of his favorite sayings was, "If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen." So Frank, I think it's time for a trip down memory lane. Can you tell me a little more about my favorite president, FDR?
Of course I can. As the Second World War drew to a close, the three great leaders met to discuss the division of power in the post-World War world at the Yalta Conference. FDR, Churchill, and Stalin agreed that Germany would be split into occupation zones, and the Eastern European nations, formerly under Nazi control, would receive free elections. The U.S.S.R. was promised northern Japanese islands and control over Manchurian railways. Overall, the Yalta Conference was later criticized by those who felt that the U.S. had handed territory in China and Japan over to the U.S.S.R. The other side countered by asserting that the concessions offered by FDR prevented the U.S.S.R. from taking even more. But Abe, can you tell me more about the interplay at this time between the U.S. and the U.S.S.R.?
Yes. Relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union grew colder and colder for several reasons. One, America excluded the Soviets from their atomic weapon developments and ended Lend-Lease aid to the USSR in 1945. Two, Stalin, above all, wanted to ensure the safety of the Soviet Union by establishing spheres of influence in Eastern and Central Europe. And the Americans, however, saw these spheres of influence as the birth of a threatening Soviet empire. Three, both nations also tended to use missionary diplomacy and to influence the rest of the world with their conflicting political doctrines. It is no surprise that the Cold War soon developed between America and the USSR. Thank you for watching. Please like,
comment,
and subscribe. And we'll catch you guys, as always, next time.